You're listening to the Lanterns Radio Network. We are the network dedicated to empowering the individual, illuminating the truth, defending American exceptionalism, and inspiring future generations. Stay connected and get involved at lanterns.buzz for great radio. Get commentary and news of the day. Lanterns.buzz.
Welcome, fellow patriots. Get ready for an hour of unabashedly pro-American, pro-conservative, and pro-biblical principles. This is the Blake Johnson Program.
Welcome to it, everyone. This is the Blake Johnson Program here on the Lanterns Radio Network. Thanks for stopping by. Hope you've enjoyed your weekend. I know I've enjoyed mine. We have a jam-packed show for you today. So many important discussions to be had, and I've been really excited about it for the past several days especially. I want to talk about a topic that has caused quite a bit of a stir on social media the past few days, particularly with Christians, surprisingly enough, though I guess I shouldn't be too surprised, honestly. And it all relates to a blog post from a Matt Walsh. So you may already have some idea of where I'm going, because more than likely, if you've been on the internet the past few days, you've seen this article pop up. So I want to spend some time on that, and I'm going to introduce a new segment to this program, which will be the final segment of each show, so I'm really excited about that. But first, joining me right now on the show is probably going to be the highlight of my radio career, however that winds up going, because it's all about Star Wars. So been teasing this for a little bit, but joining me right now is my guest, Stephen Kent. He is the host of the Beltway-banthas podcast. This is a podcast that focuses on Star Wars and Star Wars fandom, but it also mixes in politics, interestingly enough. It talks about the politics of Star Wars and how some of those are parallel to what's going on in our world today. They also talk about some of the Star Wars news, the gossip, hype, and everything that comes along with such a pretty iconic franchise. So, Stephen, thank you for joining me on the show today, and thanks for stopping by.
Hey, Blake, good morning. Nice to be up with you.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely one of those interviews that I can get pretty excited about, because we're both big into Star Wars, and you've actually been doing this podcast for a while now. So tell us more about why you decided to start this podcast. I know there's several different kinds of Star Wars podcasts out there, but yours is pretty unique and pretty interesting in that it talks about politics. It mixes in some of the philosophical things about Star Wars, but also the political discussions. And so to tell us more about why you decided to start that and what made you want it to be unique in that way.
Yeah, so the first time I ever thought that there might be something worth tapping into was during the Republican primary in 2015, and Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio had it out on stage, and Marco Rubio called out Jeb. And then Jeb tried to shoot back at Marco Rubio for his low attendance record and voting pattern in the Senate. And then Marco Rubio kind of came back at him and just swept the leg out from under him really badly. And then the next day on CNN, pundits and whatnot were all saying that the apprentice has now become the master, and that Marco Rubio had overthrown his master Jeb Bush. And so everyone was making these sort of Star Wars analogies to the Padawan master or apprentice master relationship. I think everybody was thinking Padawan, but then, Padawans don't kill their masters. That's what apprentices do, Sith apprentices. So I started talking to my friend at church about it when I was like, there seems to be like a just constant overlap here. I wonder if there might be an end. And so I listened to a lot of Star Wars podcasts, and I was listening to one of my favorites called Full of Sith. And it's a very it's run by a very liberal cast and crew, and they had an episode about how the prequels are about progressive politics and money in politics and all that stuff. And I agree. I think that that's generally what it is about. But it was such a loaded episode that I felt like it needed someone there to like rein it in a little bit, right?
Right.
And so I decided there needed to be a show where you discuss these things in a little bit more of a nuanced way, and also where you're not afraid to step on eggshells, because Star Wars podcasts are typically afraid to talk about politics, and political podcasts don't talk much about Star Wars. So no one was really doing anything in that space. And so I just saw all this overlap, all this opportunity, and, market forces. I jumped in and filled the void. So it's been fun. Been doing it now for about 2 years with a steadily growing audience, and we're having a lot of fun.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty interesting when you think about how politics is tied into Star Wars and vice versa, in the way that other leaders have. I know Reagan has invoked Star Wars back when he was president. I think he said something like "May the Force be with you" or something to that effect. But it's just kind of funny how it all seems
yeah, well, he launched the Star
together.
Wars missile program.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. He did. Yeah, and they mocked him for that, called it Star Wars, but it turned out to be something that was quite interesting. But so kind of
I mean, and the story there is Ronald Reagan wanted to try to get national support for a large missile defense program that could shoot Soviet rockets out of the sky. And by the sky, I mean like the atmosphere. And so he coined the term, that it was going to be called the Star Wars Missile Defense Program. George Lucas and his arts department actually sued the Reagan administration's marketing arm for this use. And the courts ended up siding with Reagan and his marketing department at the White House, because Star Wars is part of the common vernacular. It's how we describe things. And he also, famously described the Soviet Union as the evil empire. And it was not a coincidence. His speechwriter has since gone on the record and said that there was an effort to sort of tap into the excitement in the early 80s about Star Wars. So he was a very movie-savvy president, and he knew how to use it.
He really was. And just knowing that makes it even easier to like Reagan, I think. But so kind of going along with what you said earlier about mixing in politics and kind of going into an area where it might be a little, like most people would find a hard time doing that because they think, well, if I bring in politics, that's going to make people angry. Were you ever concerned about that? Like, what's the reaction been to some of the people who listen to your program? Because I know you don't just have, you obviously identify more with a conservative, libertarian-leaning mindset, but you have people who are more liberal, who are more centrist. You have different kinds of guests on your program, and you talk about all kinds of things. So, what's the reaction been to that?
Well, the reaction has been positive, because I think people want a space to talk about politics where they expect to hear about politics. I think where people get their panties in a wad is when they're listening to a program that they think is not going to be political, and then people on the program start to you get that with ESPN or whatever, and you can get that with nerd shows when some of your favorite geek podcast hosts go on some political tirade. You're like, ugh, I didn't want this to be part of this show. Mm-hmm. So Beltway-banthas, we tell you at the front, that's what this is about. And if you're okay with that, that's what we're going to be doing. My general feeling, and this is to my conservative friends, is that conservatives are the real snowflakes when it comes to hearing about politics in any sort of format. They get so attacked and offended when, areas in which you don't expect to hear politics come up, it comes up. Liberals don't really do that. I've never had that experience in the podcast and media space. They're more eager to talk about it, and I think conservatives are usually a little bit more shy about it. So this has been an interesting way to sort of bring over nerds who are conservative into a space where, like, we need to talk about Star Wars politics, y'all. We don't need to be so afraid about it just because George was a liberal. And we've had a lot of fun doing it. And I think as long as we're transparent and open and honest with our audience and sort of wearing our hearts on our sleeves, they're very forgiving, to me and also to my very progressive podcast co-host, Swara.
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing too. It kind of relates to the rest of the culture today and how it can be hard for us some of us conservatives especially to talk to people who disagree with us, but just to talk to people in general who disagree, it's a good thing to be able to have something like this, because Star Wars brings people together in all different ways. You know, it's one of those few things that people from all different backgrounds can come together and enjoy. So I feel like since Star Wars has such a integral part, politics such an integral part in Star Wars, it shouldn't be something that we're afraid to talk about. Which kind of brings me to my next question related to Star Wars specifically. Where do you see Lucasfilm and Disney taking Star Wars in the future, whether it be politics or just in general? Because you've seen The Last Jedi, I've seen The Last Jedi. We've got the Han Solo movie coming out in just a couple of months. I know there's been some division among Star Wars fans with this latest installment, The Last Jedi. Do you, particularly with how they handled, Luke Skywalker and the Force, some people are kind of upset about that. Are you as concerned about that, or do you see things from a different, or as a wise person would say, a certain point of view?
Well, I think there's a lot there. If you want to talk about the politics of the movie, or you want to talk about Luke, I am in general happy with what they did with the characters. I think, Luke needed to be grounded, and he needed to have his moment of crisis and faith. I think we all go through that at some point in our lives, and particularly someone who's been around as long as he has and seen what he's seen. It would make sense for him to have a crisis in faith and not know who he is and what he's supposed to be doing anymore. So I thought he was just a really captivating part of that movie. In terms of the politics and kind of where Disney and Lucasfilm might be taking the saga, I think that the only thing that is safe to say is that as long as we in our real world are in a populist and anti-elite mood that we have been in now for a couple of years, you're going to see that seep over into Star Wars, and you saw that play out in The Last Jedi in a couple of different ways. It's hard to know where we're going to go after Episode 9 when Rian Johnson helms this brand new trilogy that they've been talking about. Since they're going to start from total scratch. But you'll never be able to get rid of some of the political undertones that come with having directors like that. But at the same time, Disney is a big tent company. And if you want a company that is trying to make everybody feel comfortable in their audience and everybody feel wanted in that audience, Disney's going to do it. George Lucas was a dictator of a creative guy. He was going to have Star Wars his way. He was going to produce it. He was going to write it. He was going to direct it. And you are going to like it. Disney has much more of a focus group. Disney has much more of a focus group approach to making Star Wars. And while there are going to be some messages in there that we all disagree on, for the most part, they are tapping into how majorities feel. And I think that that's what's more important at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, you look at the expanded universe now known as the Legends timeline. I mean, you have all sorts of different authors adding in their own perspective on where they think the story should go. That does give me some hope that you have all different kinds of people in the future telling their own stories about Star Wars. Some you may like, some you may not like, but it gives you an opportunity to see things from a fresh perspective, which I do really appreciate that, and I'm pretty excited to see where it goes from there. But tell us real quick, as you've been doing this podcast, as you've been kind of studying Star Wars and Star Wars lore, what would you say has been the most fascinating discovery that you've discovered either while watching Star Wars, whether it be from the original trilogy, the prequels, these new ones that have come out? What's something that you looked at and you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't really notice that before. I've got to talk about this.
That's a tough question. I think something that I've just been fascinated to find out is how little George Lucas really planned for particularly the prequels to be a commentary on the Bush years. When you go back and you really look at the timeline of when the movies were coming out, when the movies were being written, and the events that were happening in our real world, the election of George W. Bush, the implementation of the Patriot Act, the invasion of Iraq and the beginning of those wars, the War on Terror. The Star Wars prequel trilogy, which was hyped in the media and the press as being a staunch anti-Bush commentary, yada, 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 yada. These movies were made before a lot of these things were transpiring. The story of the prequels is an evergreen story about the decay of a republic. It is not, I mean, there are nods to Bush, and I think you get that in episode 3 with the either you're with me or you're against me line. But I've just sort of been fascinated to find out how much about the politics of Star Wars is not crafted by the writers and the directors. It's crafted by the reviewers who review the movies and write their takes, and then we all sort of consume those takes and then recycle them. And then it becomes part of the public consciousness that the prequels were a commentary on the Bush years, and that's just not true. They were relevant to the Bush years. They were relevant, but they were not made to be a commentary. The story goes back to being made in his bedroom in the 80s, and then he started writing the movies in the 90s, and then touching them up in the early 2000s. So one thing that I've just sort of learned about the politics of Star Wars and doing this podcast is how much we create the politics of these movies and then drive those narratives forward. So in a lot of ways, I think it offers cover for people who are annoyed with hearing about the politics of Star Wars. But I think that there's some truth for both sides to it.
Right. Well, I gotta take a quick break. Would you be willing to stay for a couple more minutes and answer a couple more questions?
Yeah, I have a few. I got about 5.
All right, sounds good. We'll be right back on the Blake Johnson program. Stay tuned.
Listening to the Blake Johnson program on the Lanterns Radio Network.
And welcome back to the Blake Johnson program. We are joined again by Stephen Kent from the Beltway-banthas podcast. I know you've got to run real quick, but I just wanted to ask one more question. As we're talking about Star Wars and the future of Star Wars and where this might go, one of the things that I'm very interested to see, and I don't know if they'll do this or not, so I'm particularly interested in your take on this, is I'm really interested to see if Lucasfilm will start telling the stories of the Old Republic again. I'm personally an enormous fan of Old Republic lore, even more so, I'd say even more so than the movies in some aspect. I'd love to see characters like Revan and Malak brought on screen, or finally get to see the Mandalorian Wars, or the story of Darth Bane and the Rule of Two. Do you see that happening at any point in the future after they get done with some of these other stories that they're telling right now? Do you think they'll eventually go back to the past and start to explain some of the things that took place before the movies? Because, I mean, I would think that Disney and Lucasfilm know how much that era is loved by many Star Wars fans.
Yeah, so obviously I don't know anything. I have no insider knowledge. But to be honest, I think that they're not going to touch it with a 10-foot stick. There is a lot of emotion behind the Old Republic era and the video games and the books and everything, just kind of like some Star Wars of the past. So I really think it's an emotional powder keg that they don't want to touch because they're not going to be given creative leeway by us, the fans. You know, they're not going to be able to rethink the Revan Malak story. They're not going to be able to rethink anything and be creative because fans, frankly, are the real tyrants when it comes to Star Wars creative. And if you don't do it their way, they freak the F out and try to tank your score on Rotten Tomatoes. So I think that they're going to try to tell original stories, make up new characters, and I hope do small ball Star Wars stories about regular people in the universe, stuff that doesn't have to do with the Jedi. We saw the success with that in Rogue One to a certain extent. I think that there's so much risk to the Old Republic, and I do think that they're already taking nods from it. If you want my prediction for episode 9, I think that Rey was sort of like made in the Bastila Bastila Shan sort of mold, and that she's going to end up with a double-bladed lightsaber and sort of just remind you a lot creatively of Bastila. And I honestly think they already took the Kylo, the Revan design and put it into episode 7 for Kylo Ren. When he gets off that shuttle, I was like, oh, they've been looking at the Darth Revan design.
That's what I thought too.
I think they've already they've already tapped into it in some ways, and I think that they're going to go in a different direction.
Which is probably a good idea. I mean, you're absolutely right. When it comes to fans, the people who hate Star Wars the most are typically the fans because you do one thing wrong, and they will just take you down. I know that's been the case with many on the new movie that came out, and other things too. So that may just be best to just leave that alone. But yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I really hope they tell original stories and show us things that we've not seen before. I think that'll be quite a benefit to just introducing Star Wars to future generations. But I know I have to go, but thank you, Steven, so much for being a part of the show today. It's been a lot of fun having you on. We'll have to bring you back sometime and discuss it, especially after the Han Solo movie comes out. I'd be interested to see your reaction to that. But thanks for stopping by and being a part of the show. And just thanks for coming on.
Blake, it was really a pleasure, and happy to do it anytime. Let's definitely talk again when Han Solo starts its path to release. I know we've got a trailer coming up here in the next week.
Yeah, we do. That'll be a lot of fun. So, all right, take care, and with that, we'll be right back on the Blake Johnson Show. Stay tuned.
You're listening to the Lanterns Radio Network. We are the network dedicated to empowering the individual, illuminating the truth, defending American exceptionalism, and inspiring future generations. Stay connected and get involved at lanterns.buzz for great radio. Get commentary and news of the day. Lanterns.buzz.
Well, that was fun. Hope you enjoyed that interview with Stephen Kent. I thought it went pretty well. He's a guy who he knows his stuff. He knows his Star Wars lore. He spent many a year studying up on Star Wars, and I have to say, possibly, maybe, knows a bit more than I do. But it's always cool to take a break from some of the more depressing news and talk about things that, quite frankly, many of us can unite on. I mean, as I said earlier in the interview, Star Wars is one of those things that brings people together from all different types of backgrounds. So it's always good when you can just at least find something to enjoy talking about together. I will say, though, as a conservative, I will just pre-warn you if you decide to check out this program. First of all, if you want to check out the show, just go to iTunes. I believe that's where they have it. Just Beltway-banthas podcast is the name of it, and you just look it up, and it should be up there. Or just anywhere else you can find podcasts, but it's primarily through iTunes. But I will say, I mean, this is a political Star Wars show that they do. And his co-host is very liberal, which is fine. I mean, that, it's whatever you want to believe. They have guests on there from different backgrounds, but there are times where, it can get a little frustrating as a conservative to hear some of the arguments that are made. But at the same time, I think it's a good thing to be pushed out of your comfort zone. It's a good thing to be pushed on what you believe and to really think about it, and to at least listen to the other side. So that's what I enjoy about the show. Doesn't mean I don't get frustrated, but it's good to get frustrated sometimes because it pushes you to think. So, and then I will say I did disagree with about two things that he said. One of them, this idea that George Lucas was somehow a dictator with his movies. I don't agree with that at all. Because you think about this. Think about it. From the perspective of George Lucas, this is a guy who, when he started making Star Wars, he wanted to make the movies the way that he wanted them to be made, which makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, you build something, you create something, you don't want somebody else to steal that away from you. You don't want somebody else to, take over something that is your baby, that you're investing your time and money in. And after the success of the very first Star Wars, of course, you had all these film companies and film executives and so forth trying to step in and say, hey, we'll take control if you want us to. Hey, we'll do it. And it just, I don't have time to get into it fully, but it was a pretty messy situation. So much so that Lucas dropped out, I believe, of the Writers Guild, the Directors Guild, and it was just a mess because he directed the very first Star Wars, but he didn't want to direct the next two because of just behind the scenes trickery and sliminess that went on there. But then when the prequels rolled around back in the late 90s, early 2000s, he was able to direct them. And if you just watch some of the behind the scenes footage, he relied heavily on people who were around him and took advice from many people, encouraged people, hey, if you have an idea, give it to me. And you just look at some of the stuff from the prequels and you'll see that. Especially if you look at the Clone Wars TV show that took place after the movies came out. Dave Filoni, the main guy who was the main director, the supervising director essentially of the series, told everyone, he talked about it openly, that yes, George Lucas had a pretty big role in terms of making sure their episodes, their shows didn't contradict central points of Star Wars. He also, though, he gave them free license to create what they wanted to create. He encouraged them, hey, be creative, have fun with it. So I think there's a difference between wanting to own your own creation and being a dictator. Dictator is a very strong word to use for someone like that. So I would completely disagree with that. But, that's a matter of perspective. Maybe there's some other thing I'm not taking into consideration. But just from what I have seen, I beg to differ with that personally. Another thing that he said that I disagreed with had to relate to conservatives being the real snowflakes instead of the liberals. I don't agree with that. Yes, there are snowflakes in the conservative realm. And by the way, snowflake, again, just somebody who can't handle criticism, someone who can't handle a different opinion without melting down over it. Conservatives are not the ones silencing people on college campuses. Those are liberals. They're not the ones silencing people in media. Those are liberals, by and large. They are not the ones spying on reporters in news companies. Those are liberals. The Obama administration is guilty of that. The IRS under the Obama administration is guilty of that. So this notion that conservatives are the ones who are the real snowflakes, I really do not agree with that at all. Again, it is in both movements. It is definitely in Republican or Democrat, but I don't think that has as much to do with political backgrounds as it does just the fact that people are losing more and more control of how to just talk to each other and be respectful to one another, just in general. And that translates over into politics, and it also translates into faith. It translates into sports and many other aspects. But that's just my 2 cents on that. But anyway, moving on. We got so much more to talk about, and I've got to get all this stuff in. We've got a limited amount of time to do this. How about that football game over the weekend? Wasn't that amazing? Super Bowl. Oh my gosh. The Philadelphia Eagles just pulled the absolute most stunning of victories that I have ever seen. And they won, it was like 41-33, I believe. It was like an 8-point victory over the New England Patriots. And nobody saw that coming. There were people who were hopeful, but in all reality, you dig deep down, you're like, the Patriots, they've won, 5 Super Bowl wins? And in just the past several years or something like that. I'm not an expert on it, but they've won a lot of Super Bowls. And they're the top dog. Philadelphia Eagles. They've been around since I think 1933. Never won a Super Bowl before. They were the underdog of the underdogs. And somehow they came out and won. I mean, I know some of you are upset with the NFL, and rightly so, I am too, with the whole protest thing on the national anthem. And I almost didn't watch because of that. And the, what was it, the commercial that was pulled, the veteran commercial that was pulled over the Super Bowl, because they said, it was a veterans commercial, and it said, please stand for the anthem. And it talked about patriotism. They pulled that. Interestingly enough, they pulled that, but they allowed this bullcrap, was it T-Mobile? This T-Mobile ad that talked about gender, it was like the gender pay gap and gender fluidity, something like that. It was just a mess. Just very, very liberal propaganda, and quite frankly, unscientific propaganda as well. And they'll air that, but they won't air a veterans thing because we can't be political. Oh, okay, that's BS. That's just flat out BS on their part. But the reason that I decided to watch it, and I almost didn't, was because, for one thing, I never said this before, but the Eagles have been my team for past few months, because I'll be honest, I'm a latecomer to sports, to the NFL. I'm a latecomer to things like that. I've only recently started to begin to get interested in it, in terms of just sport, in terms of watching it. But I hadn't picked a team yet. But I was looking to see if there's a possibility of at least one team. They don't have to be a great team, but just one team that has the qualities that make a team easy to admire. I'm not necessarily talking about the fans, but the team itself. And looking at the Philadelphia Eagles and how they were able to, just the honor and integrity that they have as players, as a team, is something to admire. I mean, these guys are, by and large, it's a Christian team. I think most of the players on the team are Christian. They have their own Bible study groups, their own prayer groups. I think one of the members is a pastor. I know the quarterback, Nick Foles, he said that when he retires, he's going to be a youth pastor, and he's already, I think he's already enrolled in the seminary, which is amazing. That is fantastic. I love that. But yeah, their faith, their strong faith, was a huge pull for me. That's what really pulled me in and said, okay, I'm an Eagles fan. I know they've never won before, but I mean, come on, that's pretty honorable. And the fact that none of the players had ever knelt during the national anthem. When that whole shenanigan was going on, none of the Eagles players knelt during the national anthem. So that really spoke to me too. And then just the fact that I love an underdog story. I am a huge fan of underdog teams winning and beating the best of the best. We cheer for that in movies. And it was so surreal. I still can't believe it actually happened. It was like watching the greatest sports movie of all time, and it's real, live, right in front of you. It was amazing. I loved every minute of it. And there's several moments in the game I was like, how in the world did this play actually go through? And the parts of the Eagles. It was an amazing game. The best game I've ever seen, bar none. So that was something to get excited about. But yeah, that's pretty great. Now, what's not so great is some of the fans of Philadelphia. What are you guys doing? Trashing your own city, collapsing canopies, burning and setting a blaze to, the street, and rolling over cars and things. That's disgusting. That's despicable. Okay, there's nothing wrong with celebrating a victory, but you don't have to go on basically full-on riot mode, essentially. That's ridiculous. Now, to be fair, I'm not going to cast that as the Eagles fans as a whole, because there were plenty of Eagles fans that did not do that. But there were plenty of them that did, and that's shameful. It really is shameful. I don't care who you are. That's ridiculous. But yeah, the underdog of the underdog story, I just love that so much. And it was so sweet, too, to see them win the way they did. Because if it had been anybody else, if somebody else had pulled up an upset and defeated the Patriots in the playoffs, and it was the Eagles against some other team that never won before, well, it still would have been awesome. It would have been, you would have heard, right, if the Eagles won the Patriots fans will be like, yeah, well, they wouldn't have won if we would have made it to the Super Bowl. Well, first off, you didn't. But secondly, you actually did, and sucked. You guys lost that one. So that's all I have to say about that. So, yeah, great game. All right, moving on to probably the most controversial topic I have discussed in a while. Certainly the most controversial topic I've seen anybody in Christian circles talk about. There's a post from my favorite writer, blogger, Matt Walsh. He is a Christian conservative blogger. He used to work for The Blaze, and now he's working for the Daily Wire. And he's very open and honest about his faith. He's a Catholic, but a lot of the things, most of the things he posts, I agree with. I'm like, wow, this is awesome. And he posted something a few days ago that is, oh my gosh, it's caused quite a stir. And especially among Christians. I'm at the point where I really shouldn't be surprised at all to see just how easily Christians compromise and try to substitute, they try to bring in secularism into their faith and say, well, I still believe, so that's all that matters. It's a lazy approach, to be quite honest with you. But here's what Matt wrote about. First of all, here's the headline. It says, this is from his piece, it says, "Yoga is a pagan ritual. Maybe Christians should find a different workout routine." And he goes through and he talks about how, it has its roots in paganism. It has its roots in Hinduism. And he said, let's see here. He says, "We know that yoga means to yoke or to unite. It has its roots as an ancient Hindu practice meant to unite a person with his body and with the universe. The classic mantras that people repeat in yoga to help them meditate, Soham means I am the universe self, are all in service to this mission of oneness. It is a pantheistic practice because it derives from the belief that we are all a part of some great flow of cosmic energy, which has no original author, and in which we all are born and then reborn into over and over again. Yoga is supposed to bring us into harmony with this energy." You can find the word yoga and the basic concept in Hindu texts dating back thousands of years. It's true that the modern Western version is not entirely the same as its traditional form, but I do not see that as a mark in its favor. After all, it's no coincidence that it was exported to the West hand in hand with the philosophy of the universality of all religions, and it finally began to explode in popularity with the counterculture movement of the 60s. Hindus have their spiritual purposes for yoga, we have ours. Neither purpose seems at all compatible with Christianity. So, if we follow the trajectory of yoga, we begin with pagan spiritualism, trace it through the anti-Christian counterculture revolution, then sprinkle on a bunch of New Age gibberish, and here we land with the modern-day yoga class. Is it really crazy to think that perhaps this thing, with its combination of ancient paganism and New Age mysticism, may not be an advisable hobby for Christians? Of course, yoga apologists will say that the spiritual aspect and the physical acts can be separated. I think that's a bad argument for 3 reasons, and he lays out these 3 reasons. First of all, in great many cases, there is not even an attempt to separate the two. Many yoga classes feature these same pagan mantras and meditation techniques which seek to put us in touch with the universe and so on. For this argument to work, you would need to find a yoga class that leaves all of that out. It seems pretty cut and dry that a Christian should not be performing physical acts of worship to pagan deities while performing meditations meant to bring him into oneness with the energy of the universe or whatever. But what about forms of yoga that do attempt to strip the spiritual aspects out of it? Which leads to the second point. The whole point of yoga is that you can't sever its physicality from its spirituality. That's literally the definition of yoga. It would seem that a non-spiritual yoga is a contradiction in terms. It's like trying to make G-rated porn. Either it's G-rated or it's porn. It can't be both. Either it's yoga or it's non-spiritual. It can't be both. He goes on, and he goes into his third point. He brings up John Piper and what he wrote. He says that we are asking the wrong question about yoga. Rather than, can I perform yoga while avoiding the many spiritual pitfalls inherent to it, it should be, will this clearly help me in my walk with Christ? Is this an act of good? It's very telling that most of the pro-yoga arguments I read from Christians seem to focus on the possibility that a Christian could do yoga while carefully making sure to drown out or skip all the pagan stuff. I thought this was a well-written article by a pro-yoga writer named Katie Kimball, but here's her conclusion. Yes, practicing yoga could be a sin. Yes, practicing yoga could be a pathway down which one could fall into pagan worship and away from God. However, doing a yoga pose is not an automatic pathway to hell. And then he says, I would never, of course, call it an automatic pathway to hell. But if it's not an automatic pathway to hell, is the best justification. If that's the best justification you can construct for doing something, isn't it best to just not do that thing? What is the point of trying to repurpose pagan worship for the sake of getting a nice workout? What's wrong with just using an elliptical machine? How is the kingdom advanced? How is an individual's actual spiritual fulfillment attained by participating in a pagan ritual? Is this how we cloak ourselves in the armor of God? Ephesians 6:11. He says there may be some physical benefits to bowing to Mecca 5 times a day. I'm sure you could get a nice lower back workout, but of all the ways to exercise your back, why would you choose to prostrate yourself to Allah? Indeed, I wonder how the Christian yoga apologist would respond to a workout routine based around Muslim prayer. My guess is that they would make every argument against it that I have made against yoga. But they don't apply it to yoga because yoga is just a normal part of life, and so they don't question it. And then he also brings up the Ouija board comparison. He says, yes, you can mess around with something like that innocently. But why? Is this a form of entertainment that Christians should seek out? What's wrong with just playing Monopoly instead? He says, I don't think you'll be automatically possessed if you do yoga. I don't think all yoga practitioners go to hell, but neither do I see a pagan ritual, how that could ever help someone get to heaven. And maybe that's reason enough to just leave it alone. Now, I don't know about you, but I read that piece and I thought, okay, well, that seems pretty reasonable. I mean, coming from my perspective, I don't remember how many times my pastor says, the goal of a Christian in their walk with Christ is to not see how close they can get to the line between righteousness and the line between that and sin. The goal is not to get as close to the line of sin as possible. The goal is to get as far away from sin as possible, to live a life of holiness. That's what the Christian walk is all about. And again, as he pointed out, yoga has its history in paganism, in pantheism, in Hindu worship. And it's not just Matt saying that. I did some research into that. Look it up. Look it up yourself. Its roots are in pagan worship. That's what it's there for. That's what the poses are there for. Now, am I saying that there's no way that you could possibly do yoga without cutting out some of the spiritual aspects of it? I'm sure you could, but then it's not really yoga now, is it? It's not yoga. I mean, again, even the word yoga comes from that. It means to unite. Well, to unite with what? And he got just pummeled for it all over social media. People just tearing him apart left and right, but mostly on the right, mostly from Christians. And it was pretty sad. And I think it was the next day he wrote up a follow-up piece, which is, I think, another very good piece. And it talks about how, sadly, many Christians today are denying the fact that demons exist, that the devil exists, that there are evil forces at work in this world. And it seemed to be that many people who were arguing for yoga were using that argument that, well, Satan's not at work in this. He's not going to use that. Are you kidding me? He's at work all over the place. And I remember one of my relatives, when she was younger, she played around with a Ouija board, not intending anything with it. Just, it's a game. Let's try it. and she felt the power of Satan in that game. So I tell you, the devil is alive and well, as Scripture says. He's roaming around seeking somebody to devour, like a roaring lion. And to deny that is to play right into the devil's hands, I'm telling you. And I know I'm going to get flack for this, but I don't really care. I mean, I've never done yoga, never will. There are people who say, well, you know, old people get benefits out of it, people who suffer from injuries, things like that. There are multiple different avenues that you can go down for exercise that can take care of your body. You don't need to rely on that. And obviously, there's going to be some appeal there, otherwise so many people wouldn't do it. But just because something feels good doesn't mean something is good. And that's the truth. So, I agree fully with Matt. Now, I will say, I'm just going to be completely honest with you guys. I do take some issue with Matt, because he is being a little bit of a hypocrite here. I think it was back in October, he posted a piece fully in support of Halloween, and saying that there's nothing wrong with celebrating Halloween. Well, Halloween, again, it's a pagan holiday. It has its roots in paganism and spirit worship, and you know, it's a sick and demented kind of holiday. Does that mean if you celebrate it that you're an evil person? No. Doesn't mean you're sinning either. But to just dismiss it and dismiss its history, I think is foolish. So, you know, I applaud Matt for his stance on this yoga deal, and I agree with him, but you've got to be consistent. You can't be going around saying we should abstain completely from yoga because, you know, it doesn't further your walk with Christ. Well, by that logic, neither does celebrating Halloween. And by the way, I don't celebrate Halloween either. So that's just my belief. So we've got to be consistent on both sides. Both sides. All right, I'm going to take a break and then come back with the last segment of the show, this new segment that I'm going to start doing. I'm pretty excited for it. I hope you will stay tuned. This is the Blake Johnson Program on the Lanterns Radio Network. Here on the Blake Johnson Program. Been enjoying the show today. I hope you've been enjoying it as well. This is the last segment of the show, and this is something that I'm going to make a regular segment of this broadcast. And I might be working on the title of it some, but I'm going to start by calling it Blake and Bible. Basically a devotional segment of the end of each show. This is something that I did back in college as a segment of my show where I talked about, just the Word of God, read from Scripture, did a devotion kind of thing. So I wanted to bring that back. I wanted to go back to my roots, and because it's important, and my faith is central to who I am. It is who I am, and I really want to share the Word with you before you head off for the week, especially since it's Monday. It's the first day of the week. This will be something that you can keep with you for the rest of the week as well. And this is something that I read in this devotion that I'm in. It's called In Touch. It's a part of Dr. Charles Stanley's devotionals. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's a famous pastor, I think in Georgia. I want to say Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia. But he's a very famous pastor there. And it talks about serving. This was the devotional from last Friday. Let me read to you from Colossians, chapter 3. And it starts off by saying, "Since then you have been raised with Christ, set your hearts on things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways, in the life you once lived. But now you must also rid yourself of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Don't lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its Creator. Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace. And be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly, as you teach and admonish one another, with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. And then it talks about, later on, it says, Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to carry their favor, but with sincerity in your heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. And I just loved that all around. Now, I know the devotional itself dealt with the last couple of verses I just read about submitting and, doing service with a sincerity, with a sincere heart. And it talks about how, if we know that we serve Christ, if we're doing it for Christ, that will change how we do our job. That will affect the quality of our work. It will guard our attitude. It will prevent discouragement, because if we're serving with the mindset of getting praise from somebody else, from another man or woman, then we're going to be disappointed, because we're all human, we're all flawed, right? So we're not always going to get that approval. But if we're doing it for Christ, if we're doing it for God, then that changes everything. Because then, you're doing it for a more eternal purpose. And that's something that spoke to me a lot, because, I have a couple of different jobs. I have this job, which is just, weekly, a part-time thing, and then I have my full-time job. And I don't know about you, but I struggle with discouragement sometimes. I struggle with worrying about what people think about what I'm doing. And it can be easy if you hear one negative thing, you just get discouraged for the rest of your day. But I had to remember when I read that, it really spoke to me to remember to do everything for the glory of God, not for the glory of man. And I just feel like that's something that can really encourage, especially since it's Monday. Monday is just that day, I gotta go back to work, gotta do all these different things. But I feel like this could really, but just put that into perspective, a fresh perspective, I think. It's definitely something to be thinking about and pondering, and hopefully apply it to your life. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you, and hopefully you'll get some encouragement out of that. And hopefully next week I'll spend a little bit more time talking about that. So with that, I'm going to send it off. This is the Blake Johnson Program. Thanks so much, everyone, for stopping by. I have really appreciated it and enjoyed you being a part of the show. We'll see you back here next time. Take care, everyone, and God bless.